the CEO. Thank you, recording in progress. Make sure we know that. I'm the CEO of the New Zealand Story, and I'll tell you, my plan this morning is to tell you a little bit about what we do, what our kind of assets are, what you can expect from us, but actually to dwell more a little bit on the actual, essence of New Zealand's story, and hopefully prompt a little bit of conversation and input and debate. And then Alex, as mentioned, Alex from One Picture, we've asked him to come along. As you'll hear, hello Alex. We do quite a bit of work with understanding international perceptions of New Zealand, and so we wanted to showcase some of that to you this morning because it might be useful. The information on there I think will be useful, certainly enlightening, and it's an example of the sort of work that we do on a regular basis. So I'm going to share my screen as well, and hopefully we can get started. So I guess the strap line at the bottom there, the essence of the New Zealand Story is about making New Zealand famous for more good things. Some of you will know a little bit about us. Some of you might know quite a bit, but I also am aware that the New Zealand Story as a group, who we are and what we do, is not necessarily fully understood. So indulge me if you don't mind while we talk a little bit about who we are and why and what we do. And we'll start with the why, actually. And the why is the picture behind me, if you can still see me. This picture, which is this amazing and beautiful and, to a New Zealander, probably quite, emotionally stirring picture of a beautiful piece of New Zealand's backcountry scenery. And to a large extent, our most visible global story, which is the fact that New Zealand is a beautiful country. And there's nothing wrong with being a beautiful country. We love it. It's certainly the most visible part of New Zealand's kind of international outreach. The challenge for us, of course, is that if and when this becomes the only story of New Zealand, and that's really what the New Zealand Story is here to do. So there's two problems with this picture here. One is the 100% Pure New Zealand has been a startlingly successful campaign from a tourism point of view. And certainly it is a very visible part of New Zealand's international footprint. People around the world know that 100% Pure campaign. It has some challenges in that it's not necessarily it's a brand promise. It's not necessarily a reality at all times, as we all know. And the second problem that it has is that it sort of depicts New Zealand as this empty country where there's not much stuff going on. And people miss a whole lot of the attributes of New Zealand that we would like to celebrate and showcase. And so it's kind of incomplete and not always correct. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep doing it. We will, the tourism operators, Tourism NZ, etc., will still tell the story of 100% Pure. It's this aspirational place to visit. But we know that we need to do more. And here's kind of why. When you do research and international perceptions of New Zealand, very consistently you notice these sorts of trends, is that people understand that we're a beautiful place to visit. On the spider chart you can see natural beauty is very high. They don't even understand that we may be a welcoming culture, which is great, but we don't have an image of being a country that is high on history or culture, national culture, or innovation or technology. And so this is where the challenge is that New Zealand's profile globally is incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. And so that's why the New Zealand Story exists, and this is who we are. So basically, we're a government-funded organisation. We actually have the joy of being owned by multiple government agencies. I'll show you in a minute. And our job is to create resources for organisations who are operating internationally, exporters, education providers, diplomats, to showcase New Zealand in its more full sense, I suppose. Not just a beautiful place to visit, but also a place where innovation and technology originates from, a place that's trustworthy to do business, a place of high quality food and beverage. So the role that we have is to showcase us in more of a totality. As I mentioned, we're a part of what we call NZ Inc. And when we talk about that, we mean kind of the collection of government agencies who think about international outreach. So we're owned by Tourism New Zealand, Education New Zealand, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, MPI, and Te Puna Kōkiri. Essentially, that means I have 6 bosses. But it works surprisingly well because those agencies are all together agreeing that we need to tell a more fulsome story of New Zealand on the global stage. And that's the role we have as an organization. So what I thought I'd do is just dive into that. And now I know I'm talking to a bunch of expert marketers, communicators, PR people, designers. And so you'll indulge me if we go a little bit sort of deep, and then we'll come back to the sort of more tactical later. But I wanted to just sort of take you on, I guess, a little bit of the journey of the story of New Zealand as we see it. And that is a narrative about a country and who we are and what we stand for in the world. And that's quite a large aspiration for us to be able to portray that. But it's been a process we've been working through over the last 10 years. We've been around 10 years now, and we've gone through various iterations of what the story is and more refinements, etc. The latest sort of work we've been doing started by looking backwards at, if you like, the whakapapa, or the origin story of our country, because that's really the moments that have shaped us through history, drawn on this big, non-linear really timeline of major events. And it's based on the whakatauki, the beautiful whakatauki, kia whakatōmuri te haere whakamua. I walk backwards into my future with my eyes fixed on the past. So this idea that, in other words, to move forward, you really need to understand where you've come from. And certainly in Māori culture, that idea of walking backwards into the future, and carrying your past with you is really important. And so that's sort of how we started the recent iteration of understanding and kind of deepening the New Zealand story and the values and who we are as a country. And so as I say, we're getting to kind of the deep, I suppose, underpinning the brand promise and the values. We've looked at stories like the history of New Zealand and the Māori navigators and the Polynesians, who were the greatest explorers the planet's ever seen, crossing the vast Te Moana Nui Tara to get to New Zealand. And the fact that they were seeking a better life, that was the start of a clue 800 years ago. And New Zealand was the last major landmass on the planet to be occupied by humans, because they were looking for something better and different. Similarly, innovations through our history, and if I'm going to go through a whole pile of them really fast, the 40-hour work week, New Zealand invented that. It was Samuel Parnell in Petone in Wellington who came up with the idea of that men, he said men, and he did say men, God gave us 24 hours a day. We should use 8 of them for sleeping, 8 of them for working, and 8 to do whatever we will. So that was one of the first other innovations there, about creating this better life than he'd had in London. Women's right to vote, we know this one. The fact that New Zealand was the first country in the world to offer every adult the right to vote. It's an important part of our history. Things like the Wanganui River and the work that's been done there to recognise the sovereignty and independence of the river as if it were a person, and to give it the rights and obligations of a legal person. So really kind of innovative social innovation with the purpose of looking after and caring for the land and the people that live on it. And then you get into more sort of technological innovations. And again, there's sort of a thread running through these ones as well. Predator-free 2050, the idea of getting rid of all of the predators on our land. UBCO is a really good example I like, around electrification of farm bikes. And a big part of that is to actually create a more serene rural environment. We've got a whole lot of work going on in conservation and healthcare. We get into now the idea that innovation is around healthcare. Fred Hollows, of course, a pioneer who offered a lot of expertise around the world to help people save their sight. And then we get a bit more modern with our technological innovations. We've got Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, a massive part of the global response for COVID in the last couple of years, whose innovations are all around caring for people. And again, in the technological space, Dawn Aerospace, part of New Zealand's burgeoning space industry. And we love telling the story of the space industry because it's very surprising. New Zealand was the 9th country in the world to launch a rocket into space. But it's not just a one-hit wonder. We've got companies like Dawn who are not only putting craft into space, but they're doing it in a very sustainable way, minimizing space waste and minimizing minimizing the propellants that would that would have an impact on the environment. So thinking about it in a very different way, not just exploration, but also being environmentally friendly. And then Halter, another great example, if you've seen it recently, of New Zealand's technology, very advanced technology, the idea that you don't need fences and gates on farms, that you can you can use technology to control where your cattle go. And the reason for doing that is it's easier on the cattle, it's easier on the farmer, it requires less stress on the land. And finally, just one final example. Now I could go on for hours on these examples, we've got loads of them, but Kono is a really good example of a Māori-owned business, which has a 500-year business plan. And when we talk about this internationally, the concept of having anything beyond a sort of a 3-year plan is really unusual. But for an organization to think about their role as guardians of the land, not just exploiting it, is a really kind of radical concept coming out of kind of Indigenous culture in New Zealand. And so all of those examples and many, many more are the kind of whakapapa, the kind of stories that lead to what is our story. You know, the individual elements that kind of ladder up to something. And when we look at it, the common thread that we find, or the sort of the key value proposition, the brand proposition for New Zealand becomes clear, is that this is a place where care for people and connection to the place drives our ingenuity. So that's sort of the, if you like, the brand essence that we like to put out there. So 100% Pure is a great tourism story, but we like to say that our brand essence is that we are a place where care for people and connection to place drives our ingenuity. We're not the biggest, we're not the best always. Sometimes we are. We're not the fastest, we're not the richest, but boy, we care for people and we have a deep connection to the place that we come from. And that's sort of the core brand proposition. Underpinning that brand proposition then is, you know, in any good brand, you have the values of the brand, or the kind of the essences. And these are the, again, a lot of work going across multiple government agencies and the private sector actually working together to try and define New Zealand's core values. And these are the 4 that we've landed on. And the 4 of them work in collaboration with each other, sometimes in tension, but often, you know, collectively there. Manaki, many of you know the idea that you are building the mana of others, that you are withholding them, lifting them up, reciprocity, respect, hospitality. Te Aki, again, many of you will know that concept, the concept of care, of being a guardian, a really uniquely New Zealand word. In fact, there's so much packed into some of these words. Pono is this the Māori concept of acting with integrity, honesty, trustworthy, doing what is right. And so those are some core values. And then this new one that you might not have seen before, the word is pōtikitanga. Pōtiki, the word pōtiki, the first half of that word, literally means the youngest child. So in Māori mythology, Maui, the god Maui, was Maui Pōtiki. He was the youngest of his brothers. And it comes with this sort of feelings of curiosity and ingenuity, adventurousness, you know, the spirit, this youngest child looking at things differently. And so pōtikitanga is the spirit of the youngest child, or the value of the youngest child. So the 4 of these values in this value structure, if you like, work together underneath. Now, these aren't necessarily things that we go out there and have a campaign about. We don't necessarily go out there and say, New Zealand, we are pono. It more becomes the brand essence. And again, many of you are much more expert than this than I am. But you want to, as people start to experience New Zealand and see New Zealand, you want them to start to feel some of these values coming through, and say there's something about New Zealand that cares for both people and place, and is trustworthy and honest, and yet has this curiosity and this innovation and this sometimes, you know, almost bold, curious nature. So those are the core values. We did some international market research, so that we weren't just sort of sitting in a room in Auckland or Wellington talking to ourselves and believing ourselves. We wanted to understand, what does the world think of us? And we tested, as part of it, we tested these concepts, these phrases, and also the brand proposition. And we thought, does it ring true for people who know a little bit about New Zealand, or people that know nothing about us, or people that know a lot about us? And universally very well received, and with a wonderful quote there from one UK consumer as an example. You know, these are aspirational things for us as a country. They're a bit surprising that a country's brand wouldn't be about, hey, we're the biggest and we're the best, or you should invest in us because you get the best return on investment. all that stuff is, I'm sure, important, but actually you need to get underneath it to find out who we are as people and as a country. And actually that's given us a bit of a framework for this brand work that we've been doing. And as I say, one of New Zealand Stories roles is to create the brand essence of New Zealand. You can see that at the bottom, our values are implicit. We don't necessarily go out there and talk about them as individual things, although of course sometimes those words come through because they're so powerful. And that proposition is something also that isn't necessarily a campaign, but it does power campaigns that sit across it. And on the top there, those top 5 or 6 things, 7, can't count, are actually campaigns from different government agencies. And the idea is that as an agency, Tourism or Education New Zealand or NZTE, whatever, does a campaign, it should really very much hook into and rest on this value proposition and these values underneath it. So that's sort of the brand architecture. Now, the reason I go into all of that and deeply is because I know that you're comms professionals and experts in this. The visible, if you like, for New Zealand Story, the bit that consumers or businesses would see if they come and ask us for, what have you got? They'd see this. So this is the New Zealand Story service offering, what we offer to the businesses that come in and ask for our help, the more visible parts of it. So in essence, we offer 5 things. The toolkit is in fact, I've got a little picture of that. Toolkit is a royalty-free image library, video library. We have infographics, presentations, PowerPoints, pitch decks, that sort of thing. So we have a very rich, and it's constantly growing. We invest quite a lot of time and money to make sure that our image library is being constantly expanded. And we would love you to, in fact, feel free to use any of these images and video and work that you're doing with your clients, or to point some of your smaller clients to it. We know that lots of New Zealand businesses use this heavily, and it's great because it we've purposefully chosen images that showcase New Zealand's core brand. So that's the first part of our offering, if you like, is the toolkit. In the area of content, that relates to the work that we do mostly internationally, actually, but sometimes here in New Zealand, where we're creating stories, videos, PR pieces, getting media placements around New Zealand stories, particularly into international markets. And that's with the idea of sort of changing or growing the perceptions of New Zealand. We're going to be doing quite a bit of that over the next couple of years, actually, really seeding stories into the international market. The third piece there, I'll come back to, but that's the research work, and we're going to example of that this morning with Alex. The 4th line there, consultancy, a relatively new thing for us, but we know that New Zealand companies need some extra help, and particularly large-scale sector groups, other government agencies, and major events that happen globally. For example, trade missions when they go out of New Zealand into international markets, or the Expo, for example, which I was recently at in Dubai last week, are opportunities for New Zealand to tell our story on a global stage. And we need to, as a New Zealand Story Group, as an organization, we need to engage with other organizations. And then the last thing there I'll mention, and in fact, I've got a bit of a drill in, is the Fernmark program. So the Fernmark, hopefully you recognize it, very distinctive. It's on the side of Air New Zealand's planes, on the Team New Zealand boats. It's on Rocket Labs rocket ships. And basically we license the Fernmark. We hold the responsibility of that trademark for New Zealand, which is globally one of the most recognized symbols of New Zealand, according to the research that we've done and has been done independently. That Fernmark is a really linked back to New Zealand. So New Zealand companies, if they're interested in trying to kind of collaborate or be associated with New Zealand, licensing the Fernmark is probably the best way they can do that quickly, and they can put that on their product labels and websites and that sort of thing. So I mentioned research because I'm about to transition over to Alex in a minute or two, but the research is a really a rich part of our workload, because we know that in order for you to do a good job of marketing to an audience, you need to know what that audience's perceptions are of you already, and what are their needs and fears and frustrations and hopes and dreams. So you need to know the markets. And so we commission on a very regular basis 3 different types of research. We have a sort of a social listening tool where we're constantly monitoring for mentions of New Zealand on things like Twitter and Facebook. So we get a bit of a real-time pulse. We do quant research on a regular basis. So quantitative, pulse checks, that's quarterly or more often with different regions around the world. And that tends to be 10 to 12 major markets around the world where we want to understand what are their perceptions of New Zealand. And then more deeply, we will do qualitative research, which is obviously, as you'll all know, much more expensive, more difficult. You're trying to get panels together, you're trying to get focus groups, but it's really valuable. And in that qualitative space, we'll do global ones as often as we can, which is about once a year on average. And then we'll do market focused ones. And you can see there's some examples of those market focused qualitative research reports that we've done. All of these are published for free on our NZ Story website, by the way, so feel free to jump in. So recently, just late 2021, we did a large global pulse check. And the reason we did this is because we know that through the COVID years, 2020, 21 and 22, we're seeing some really big shifts in perception of New Zealand. And we're seeing, stop sharing while I'm talking, we're seeing two things going on. There's obviously a change of perception of New Zealand, but there's actually a change of circumstance in countries as well. So you've got individual organizations and companies and consumers whose perceptions are shifting and changing because their view of the world changes relative to what they're seeing their government do, or their health response, or their personal situation. And so this health check, this global pulse check, comes off the back of one that was done in 2020, sort of 6 months into the COVID crisis, where we started to understand what was the shifting nature of global perceptions. We recently redid this, and we thought today it would be valuable for us to maybe showcase some of that information. And the reason for doing this is, twofold. One is it shows you the sort of research that we do in collaboration with partners like One Picture here with Alex. But also, secondly, it's really critical that as New Zealand companies kind of re-emerge into the world and think about how they're positioning their products and services, or their tourism offers, or their whatever it might be, that they're really conscious of the fact that actually perceptions of New Zealand have shifted and changed, and that we need to really key into what the market perceptions are of us before we start to create a message for that market. So, if you take something away from the session, you don't get into the detail, but the one thing is make sure that you help your companies and your customers understand the global view of New Zealand before we start creating campaigns that might make sense to us, but might be a little bit of out of date with what the market expects. And I know we're going to have time for Q&A later, so I'm going to keep moving. And after Alex, we'll have some time for Q&A. But I wanted to hand over to Alex. Alex is one of the key research partners that we have. One Picture has been a great part of this, and not only doing the research, but helping us interpret and understand it. So over to you, Alex.
Awesome. Thanks very much, David. Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Alex Jones. I'm one of the strategy directors at One Picture. And what I'm going to be taking you through today is a real whistle-stop tour of what was our global pulse check in 2021. And what we were trying to do, as David was saying, was really understand the perceptions of New Zealand in this post-vaccine world. So we did this in 2020 as well. We were trying to understand the perception of New Zealand in this post-COVID world. This is almost the Godfather tour, as I've been calling it. What's that next step down the track? What's happened since? So a bit of context for this is that we did conduct the research in August of 2021. And I don't want to re-traumatize anybody, but that was when we'd just locked down. That was our first case of Delta. So the world had seen us take a really sharp right turn from being really free through to being locked down because of this case of Delta that had come through into the community. When we were going through this work, we had 4 key focus areas. So the first was to assess what had changed with our key partner markets since the vaccine discovery and rollout. And that is a key thing as we go through that rollout. The second was understand the perceptions of New Zealand in our priority markets and the impact of border restrictions, what that was having on both consumers and on businesses. Thirdly was to explore the impacts by sector and the different lead messages we need to tell the world to maintain the sense of desirability in the global market. And then fourth was really to identify all the different nuances in each market. So today we're not going to go through the country specific deep dives, but if you've got some key markets that you're really focusing on going forward, I do suggest that you download the full pack and go through. We've got a number of different markets there. We went into 10 different markets, as I mentioned there. So Australia, UK, USA, China, Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, Dubai. And we also did some focus groups in New Zealand to make sure that the local population was also feeling those same sort of things. As you'll sort of see there, we didn't do a huge amount of focus groups in each one of the different places. So as Dave was saying, international qualitative research can be a little bit difficult and expensive. So what this is a real toe dip. It was a real point in time of understanding what does the world think about New Zealand in this specific moment. So there's a little bit of a lens there. And even when we were presenting this back to the team before this presentation specifically, we have seen that there's been quite a few shifts in the last 6 months even. So remember that context as we go through. First of all, how has the global mood changed since 2020? And what we did find is we'll all know that 2020 was a little bit gloomy, but many were finding this hidden silver lining. So it was extremely challenging. They were fatigued, they were challenged. It was a bit chaotic. Everything was a bit sad and unsettled and uncertain. But it did give them that time to sort of reconnect and reconsider what was important to them. So the sense of family, adapting, protection, retraining, and reappreciating some of the things that they may not have in 2019. So COVID-19 really was this catalyst for rethinking how they wanted to live. But then in 2021, we were getting this new sense of balance and this joy of new beginnings coming through. So first of all was that sense of balance, that they were looking for not just work-life balance, but also trying to get their lives into perspective, which was more about sort of understanding, do I want that big car? Do I want to really push into my career? Or how do I want to live a life that's full of meaning? Part of that too is through with empathy, that increased sense of empathy that they were feeling for others around them, and for their close friends and family members. So generally there was this growing confidence that the worst was now behind them. And that was mostly due to 3 different things. So they saw the signs that life was returning to normal through successful vaccine rollouts. So there was this sense of optimism that we didn't see in 2020. That we were turning from being in a pandemic environment to an endemic environment. So this real acceptance that COVID was here to stay, it was less impactful and less harmful, and it was just going to be part of our lives going through. They're also seeing that travel was starting to open up in a lot of the countries that we spoke with, apart from Japan and Australia. That's changed now since for Australia. So if you're thinking about the fact that they could actually think about popping over to Europe if they were in the UK, or it wasn't too big of an issue to get out of the US at this point. So seeing these restrictions and rules starting to disappear a little bit. So everyone was really looking forward rather than back, with this desire for reconnection and renewal. And then in returning to this normal, the social, cultural and environmental ambitions of 2020 had started to be forgotten. So in the first pack we did, there was this real sense of almost kumbaya around coming around really big challenges that the world was facing, not just COVID. But if the world's reacted to COVID like this, then why can't we take on some of the other big challenges we're facing as a planet? So the first one being that greater sense of socio-cultural and political change. But in 2021, Black Lives Matter felt like a distant memory. The shift from what is entertaining to what's enriching. So people talking about getting back into reading books and starting a hobby and sort of being more introspective, which then switched through into 2021 as spending being seen as the way to start to rebuild global economies and putting that behind them. Secondly, was the sense of addressing climate change and emissions targets. If we've all acted so quickly for COVID, why can't we do that for climate change? But this real sense that sacrifices weren't really ready to be made when it came to that space, especially in the recovery from COVID. And then fourthly, there was a sort of hope for general actions that were good for humanity over the economy, where that started to shift in 2021 across all the different markets we were in, this desire for personal freedoms over collective good. So while everyone had hoped for this more connected life, they were defaulting back to this life where they were living with a little bit less meaning and care, and they weren't necessarily so focused on some of these big ambitious goals. So this next bit is really around each of the different countries that we went into and how they viewed their own actions when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, or their government's own actions when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're going to look at that in contrast to how they saw New Zealand acting. So this is across 3 different variables. The first one is direction. So how do they believe that decisions have been made through the pandemic? Were they clear and transparent? Were they in the best interests of their country? Secondly, when it came to protection, do they believe that their government had put their people's best interests at heart, and had they rapidly rolled out vaccines? And then thirdly is, do they believe that restrictions were starting to ease and they're starting to move towards the sort of life they used to live, free to live as they wish? And so while this can look a little bit complex, what we're finding here is the more inline the variables were, the more optimistic they were about their country, and then in turn how they viewed other countries who had acted in a similar way. So we see some of the green options here. That means that the people were really in line with the actions of their government and their people. So you're thinking different words like optimistic, pride, ambition in their country's response and how they were getting on with it. Those countries that had sort of a middling orange response were more, they felt like they hadn't quite got through the worst of it just yet. So there were still words coming through like conflicted, division, cautious, and patience. And those who were really out of line with how they saw their government reacting to COVID-19 were still really in the weeds. So the sense of frustration, pessimism, uncertainty, and worry. And you'll see there Australia was particularly red at that moment, but I do believe in the sort of 6 months since we might see some changes there. This was that snapshot of August 2021. So we generally find while COVID-19 has been this leveler that has united the world against a common enemy, the experiences each country have had are unique through that. And so what that means is that the stories we then tell need to be unique and different as we go through too. When we think about how New Zealand reacted to that through New Zealand locals that we spoke with, so optimism was really varied between consumers and exporters. And at this point, consumers were really proud of the direction and leadership that we'd had throughout the pandemic, but we were starting to see that sense of protection and freedom wane. So vaccinations weren't necessarily at where they'd like them to be at this point, and we'd just been locked down because of that Delta outbreak. So still, it was a bit of a middling response there. So words coming through like trustworthy, groundbreaking, honest, and punching. But it was a really different side of the coin for exporters. So not seeing any sense of clear timelines around how they can open up and what that might look like. A sense that we had been protected, but as the rest of the world started to open, it started to feel like we were moving behind. And with freedom, it was almost like the sense of being moved backwards as the rest of the world bounces ahead, especially when it comes to in-person relationship building and what that means. So the sense that exporters were feeling more isolated, distanced, and almost on this roller coaster. So whilst consumers and exporters had a very different view, there was this growing concern around freedom. And for exporters, it was really frustration over this lack of direction when we might get that freedom once again. Like I was saying, we do need a different message in each of the countries that we go into, and I won't go through all of these in detail, but for the likes of Dubai, they were really proud of their response, and they almost saw them as working through COVID and not really focusing on it anymore. So their future outlook was really about being normal, back to normal, and moving forward. The likes of Germany were really proud of the plan that they had in place and feeling really under control, thinking more about other issues that are coming in, not just COVID-19, but also the future of the planet. So they're really looking for structure and sensible decision-making. For the likes of Japan, they were still slightly embarrassed with how they had tackled COVID-19. They had a split version of leadership that meant that it was slightly confused as to how they went about tackling COVID-19. So there's still a bit of embarrassment there that we need to watch out for. With the likes of us, when we're actually trying to talk about to New Zealanders our COVID-19 approach, the sense of being protected, but also talking to this nervousness that the world is now moving on. How can we actually show that we have started to move on and where we're going? So this is the key part here that we were all on the edge of our seats for when we were doing the research, is how have we actually seen this change the perceptions of New Zealand on a global scale? And what works well for David and the New Zealand Story team is that global perceptions of New Zealand have continued to widen past nature to include who we are, how we live, and how we treat others. So while we've still got those associations around nature, peace, being welcoming, having a great community, having beautiful scenery, we're now being more associated with honesty, care, respect, integrity, equality, and quality of life. So with our borders closed, the global community are focusing less on our place, but hearing more about who we are as a people. So for some, this has contributed to the sense of starting to know us better and know who we are as a culture as well as a place. So where this come from? If we're thinking about how this has changed in 2020, we saw the world react to our government's COVID response. So everyone was really focused on who was the most successful at getting rid of COVID, and we were really front of mind. And in 2021, we've seen this sort of deepening understanding of how we operate as a place. So how that comes to life is the sense that they're starting to respect the sort of discipline and care demonstrated by our people, which was really hard to speak to pre-COVID-19. Secondly, everyone knew that we cleared cases quickly and claimed COVID-19 free before many others, which has now started to, for a lot of places, see us as sticking to our chosen strategy. So for some, this is idealistic, and for others, it's a little bit unrealistic that we were still sticking to the elimination route at that point. Thirdly, in 2020, a lot of different consumers were able to recall some of our memorable slogans without being prompted around them. Whereas now what's being focused on is our actions, which are hard and fast, and for some really quite extreme. And then fourthly, which is always good, there was this greater awareness in 2020 of Australia and New Zealand not being one and the same, whereas now we're being perceived in some ways as better than Australia. So I always like to see that coming through. This general hardening view of us that mostly serves us well, but there are also dimensions that don't necessarily connect with with what global consumers are looking for when they're trying to look for where's normal now, what does that look like going forward. Once again, quite a busy slide, but the way in which we explain this is those different ways in which countries saw themselves acting were their lens in which they saw how New Zealand acted. So if you look through those who had a really positive view of how we acted throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the likes of China and Australia were really the likes of China specifically really did respect that controlled approach that we took, and admiration for putting people first. So almost like because we were doing as well as them and they saw us both focusing on protection, that worked really well. For the likes of UK, they were seeing themselves as not necessarily having a really clear direction like we did, so they're seeing us in a much more positive light. For those who were seeing us in a sort of middling place like the USA and Japan, they were looking for a bit more of a sense of direction and protection, but they were really focused on freedom as a people, and they were seeing us as not necessarily getting that freedom. That consistently carries through to those who saw our response in a negative light, like Dubai and Germany, who are perceiving our actions as unsustainable and detrimental to the economy, or over the top and that would fallen behind when it came to vaccines. So we need to really carefully message how we talk about our COVID-19 response globally. It's not just like we can say that we did really well in every single market and that will work. So everyone saw our response in contrast or through the lens of their own country's response. So what that has meant generally is the world has started to view us differently. So there's a strengthening of key consideration metrics like progressive, modern, honesty, integrity, welcoming and inclusive, strong and decisive, human, it's safe and protected, especially in markets China, UK, Australia, India, Brazil, and the USA. So this real strengthening of belief that we're a decent global citizen with a culture of respect. What it's also done is start to bring some of our shadows into equally sharp focus. So the sense that we're isolated, unfamiliar, closed, unprepared, far, rural and quiet, especially in places like Germany, Dubai, and Japan. So there is really this risk of negative perceptions getting stronger if we continue to remain closed off as the rest of the world starts to open up. Really importantly as well, and to David's presentation before, the role of Māori culture gives us further credibility to our narrative of inclusiveness and care. While the level of awareness does differ by the market that we're in, we find that in places like Australia and the USA, it's never been more appreciated. And this inclusion of Te Reo is actually really powerful to support the narrative that we are inclusive and that we care for people in place. When it comes to the likes of Germany and Japan, there is an awareness of the sort of place of Māori culture in the history and the story, and that it includes a sort of intrinsic part of how we define ourselves and what that looks like. And then for those who may not understand or may not have as much of a understanding of Māori culture, there's still this desire to see it celebrated, and it still talks to that sort of narrative of inclusiveness and care as we go through. So I've been on the New Zealand Story account since about 2017, and we used to do tests. We would start with a Māori word and then explain it after that. And even 5 years ago, we found that there was a little bit of resistance if we weren't explaining the word first and then bringing Māori culture in afterwards. But what we found in this latest piece of research is this real openness to hear Māori, or to hear Te Reo, and to see us celebrating it on an international stage, and it's only strengthening our story we have to tell about being inclusive and caring as a nation. So that's the perception, how it's changed. We also drilled down a little bit into the different changing sector stories that we heard. So once again, there's a lot on each one of these pages, but what they do really well is create a bit of a snapshot of what stayed the same and what's new between 2020 and 2021. So starting with food and beverage, what we produce is now more desired, but harder to justify, and especially now in this sort of world of rising costs. So what we saw as staying the same since 2021 is the sense that New Zealand is even more expensive, and that was the case in 2021. But there is also the sense of pent-up demand and this desire for us to start actively going out and sell again. What's starting to feel new in this sense is that we are feeling further away and food miles are becoming more important. So we need to continue to push that sustainability story. It's not just the fact that we grow really sustainable produce in New Zealand, but when it's shipped around the world, it still maintains that sense of sustainability. So the challenge now is making these new connections and protecting the relationships we have in this world that's opening back up again. As we go through into primary industries in 2020, it was about battling against this growing appreciation of local, where in 2021, we just can't afford to be a commodity. So while in 2020, there was a stronger focus on supply chain and food security, people were thinking about ordering 2 or 3 quarters in advance. What they're really focusing on now is this increasingly competitive commodity market and increasingly new entrants into the commodity markets as well. So not only are we competing against Canadian salmon, we're also competing against land-based salmon farming in Dubai. So there's a whole lot of different nuances to the story now that we need to really focus on, especially when it comes to that environmental and ethical farming situation coming into play. How can we start to really talk about grass-fed and gentle and made with care, that start to talk about why our commodities aren't just commodities. So our challenge there is we're competing against this rapidly expanding corporatization of agriculture, and that's at a global scale. So how do we keep proving that New Zealand is a place worthy of spending their money? The next one's immigration. I won't spend too long on this. In 2020, we were seen as tough, fair, and never more desirable. And now we're really being left out of their consideration set because it's not currently achievable. So we really need to stay on the wish lists while our borders are formally closed. And that does work through into the creative industry as well. How can we show that New Zealand has an amazing environment, but is also great for careers? How do we show that they get the lifestyle, but they also aren't sacrificing anything by making the move? And how can that look? Keeping them on the radar whilst we're not allowing anyone in for the near future. Next, when it comes to education, so New Zealand's now a place where progressive ideas flourish. And in 2020, it was really interesting that we'd gone from a place you'd maybe go for a bit of a party if you're in university or something similar, to a place that was gaining more credibility as an area where you could learn about socio-political issues or sustainability or some of these more progressive ideas, which was a real key move in 2020. So what we saw that stayed the same was the sense that New Zealand was a place that felt safe and inclusive, which was great for those outside of sort of Euro markets. But also this view is we had this sort of reputation for not just teaching, but teaching in a way that was really inclusive and that valued education as a whole. So it was more about the whole experience rather than just grades specifically. What's new in 2021 was that because many young people had sort of delayed their education, there was this pent-up demand, but we need to be really clear about what our reopening plan looks like so we don't actually miss out on that. There was this real fear of being a pandemic generation as well, that their education might not necessarily be as to a higher standard as those who weren't in a pandemic at the time, and that they were held to a lesser standard. So we do need to keep reiterating the fact that when you come to New Zealand, you get a world-class education. So showing off why we're delivering safety and successful outcomes in this uncertain time as we go through. Tourism, which is a big one as we start to reopen. So in 2020, we saw this newfound appreciation of nature, which had actually elevated us on their bucket list. But right now, at that point, there wasn't really great certainty around border closures and people were choosing close by instead. So instead of a trip all the way down to New Zealand where the borders might close, they're thinking more of going to their neighbours. So that does extend through to Australia, where there is this broadening view of everything there is to do in New Zealand. Whenever we would go into Australia previously, people would talk about New Zealand as somewhere they'd get to eventually, whereas now it's somewhere that they're really trying to get to as soon as they can. So we need to think about those close to us, but Also for those outside that sort of Australia, Pacific Island, Southeast Asia bucket, we need to help them see past those logistical uncertainties to value visiting New Zealand when it does open and what that means for them. Then lastly, there was this sense for tech and investment that rapid digitization had worked really well for us, but we were still being seen as small and niche. So in 2021, we were being seen as a country that was a legitimate choice for startups. So we're starting to get a real sense of legitimacy in this space. So once again, before COVID, this was a really hard story to tell. And whenever we'd give consumers tech and investment in New Zealand, they'd find it really hard to line up anything, but really being seen as this sort of capable nation of awesome people that struggle against distance and a lack of, but have struggled against distance and lack of resource. So Zoom and Teams have started to make that global world closer, and it's not as much of a barrier as it used to be. So similar to the immigration point, so technology has made it easier to work from home, and we need to start talking about that better lifestyle for those in Silicon Valley that have moved down to Queenstown. What does that actually mean for them and their work-life balance? What's new is that the talent pool is actually even more globalized. We can get people from anywhere doing anything, so it hasn't limited us by our resource pool as much anymore. And this growing sense that there was a generation of tech entrepreneurs who are starting to choose New Zealand as a place to live in. So whilst there does remain this limited awareness of our capabilities and our achievements, there's some growth in this tech and investment space that needs to be really focused on, and it's quite positive. So that was that really sort of snapshot view of the deck, and I do think that it's really valuable to go through the deck in its entirety. It's about 70 or so slides, but as a key sort of wrap up, we've got 6 things to remember. So the first of which is that there is this changing global consumer, and we need to be ready to meet them before they slip into the sense of old normal. So we need to start solidifying our place while the world's still paying attention. Secondly, while each country has responded to the pandemic in its own way, we need to make sure that we're tuning our message by each market to make sure that that's lined up with their perception of how they did versus us, if we are talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and our actions throughout it. Thirdly, is that perceptions in New Zealand have widened and deepened past the sense of place to really understand us as a people and the respect we have each other. And there's this real opportunity to leverage that people story to start to strengthen that connection. Fourthly, was that being closed in a pre-vaccine world earned us a bit of respect, but as the world starts to reopen, we need to start thinking about how we talk about our reopening plan as well. And we need to be showing the world that we are well planned, moving with them, not against them. Fifthly, is that everything is getting more expensive and logistically harder, and that's only got more true in the last 6 months. So as a small and niche provider, we need to work extra hard to justify that price premium, and we always need to be finding the value in our New Zealand story. Sixthly, is that Zoom has leveled the playing field, and it's brought us close to the rest of the world, and it's given us that opportunity to overcome this long-standing shadow of distance. So a real shift from the corner of the world to a centre of digitization. And that is the pack generally. I'll pass that back over to David for any extra little pearls of wisdom or clarification.
That's great. Thank you, Alex. Really, insightful study. As mentioned earlier, we do those very regularly, the qual researches like that one, and more regularly still the quantitative research. I guess before we open up for questions, just a final kind of so what. Everything we talked about this morning, the New Zealand story and the values work I showed you, as well as the toolkit, the service offerings we have. What would we suggest you do? You know, you're all marketing and design and communications professionals. These are the sorts of things you might want to consider with your clients. First of all, that perception research, which we publish very regularly, you can download that from our website. We do webinars quite regularly to take people through it. So engage with that. There's a lot more to it. I mean, Alex just showed you a very high level version of that deck. The second one is that the core strategy here is that New Zealand as a country is a very small, obviously, country on the international stage, and we would love for us to be able to amplify each other's efforts. So not just at a company level, but at a sector level, whether that's food or beverage or tourism. And so basically, how do we use the values and the value proposition to kind of inform the campaigns, the narratives, the work that we all do? Because that will help your customers and you see that there's value in that alignment. I use the example of the New Zealand wine industry. 20 years ago, if you went to Europe and tried to talk to people about wine, first of all, you'd have to convince them that New Zealand is a country on the other side of the planet. Then you'd have to convince them that we actually make decent wine. Then you'd have to convince them that your particular winery makes good wine. And then you might start building your own brand. So globally, when people hear about New Zealand, they have positive perceptions, and then they have some things that are not quite right or incomplete. So constantly reinforcing the values, the brand, the kind of essence of New Zealand in the campaign work that we all do is a key part of growing the kind of totality. And then the final thing there is, please, consider the fern mark. It's a great way, particularly for, there are key markets around the world where that fern mark is very valuable. It's seen as desirable that food and beverage, for example, comes from New Zealand. So consider utilizing that and becoming a licensee for that as well. It shows not just a provenance mark, but it's also a mark of sort of government support, if you like. We've QA'd you. So those are some key actions you might want to think about taking away. But Simon, it might be good to stop talking now and start listening or responding to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. Thank you, Alex. Open to questions now, and do feel free to put your cameras on and come off mute if you want to ask a question. Look, I'll start, David. I saw on social media last week you were off somewhere glamorous involving an airplane at an expo, and I suppose I was keen to get your sort of very current view on mood and sentiment out there, because it feels to me like I feel very blinkered in terms of having really no sense beyond what I can see immediately in front of me, which feels to be super cautious still. And are we out of step with the world in the level of caution that we're currently experiencing and applying? And how does the world feel?
Yeah, great question. So yes, I mean, I went to Dubai last week for the World Expo, and for those of you who might not realize that the Expo 2020 got started in 2021 and is still going in 2022. So thank you, COVID, for mucking up with the logo. But it's an amazing experience if you've never been to a World Expo. I had never been to one. 192 countries were sort of exhibiting there. But it's not an exhibit like a kind of a trade show. It's much more like a festival or an extravaganza of culture, of business, of government, of arts, and it's quite an incredible thing. I wrote an article and stuff about it just this week, and I described it as sort of big day out for grown-ups, for business people. So that was good, because it was a great opportunity to kind of see many different cultures, as well as the local Emirati culture in Dubai. Of course, that there are people flying in from all around the world for this thing. So in many respects, that's been New Zealand's sole international diplomacy outreach work in the last 2 years, because essentially we've done very little communicating externally about what we're doing and who we are, quite consciously, but we have this showcase of New Zealand. So I mean, I guess if I've given you a kind of a quick feel of it, I'd say, yes, definitely the world is readjusting to COVID. And I think Alex made a really great point that the definition of success now is different than it was a year ago. It used to be, a year ago, the definition of success was how few were your COVID cases, how little impact it's had on human health, what's the death rate, that sort of thing. Now the definition of success is how well are you integrating a new way of working? How have you readjusted to a life with COVID? And different countries are at different speeds. Even in the UAE, where I was, they've only just got rid of the mask mandate for outside only about 3 weeks ago. So up until 3 weeks ago, they were wearing masks, in everywhere outside. It was mandated. And of course, in that heat, it's ridiculous. So New Zealand's not particularly far behind on that, from that point of view, in terms of the way that we're kind of reopening. But I'd make the observation that people in their everyday lives have just worked out how to get on with it. Business is sort of restarting. And so that's, for New Zealand, it's really important that as we re-emerge out of our 2 years worth of sort of self-isolation, that we think about going back out into the world with confidence, a small amount of modest pride about what we've been doing down here, but without being cocky about it. But realize that the rest of the world has probably had a lot worse time than we have. you know, when you talk about some of the impact on some countries, both economically and from a health point of view, we've done pretty well actually, relatively. So I think we can be emboldened as we emerge. But it's quite nice to get out of the country, I have to say that as well. Not that I don't love New Zealand, I do, but when you get out there in the world, you get a whole different perspective of us.
Thank you. Okay, open to questions. Anyone got a question they would like to ask?
What's your favourite finding?
From the research generally?
Yeah.
I think it is that growing understanding of people and who we are. So I'm sure David has a favourite finding as well. But for me, when we were out in market, I went to Germany in 2019, and the hardest story we could tell was that New Zealanders were smart and we were doing all these cool things, and that we had all these different credentials when it came to launching rockets and doing all these different innovative things. But it's really what COVID has sort of done, which is a positive, is really help the world see who we are and what we can do. So there's no amount of spend that we could have done in 2019 to convince the world that we were this really smart, intuitive, and problem-solving country. And now we do have that in our back pocket, and I think that's a huge asset that we can't forget about.
Yeah, maybe I'll just join in there. Every time we see these research reports, they're so in depth. You learn a lot. And I guess the thing I learned from seeing the work that Alex showed you just then was this important idea that it's not just that there's like a global consumer who's this static organism who has this perception of New Zealand, because their world is very dynamic as well. And so when you see these different countries around the world and you get the different perspectives from consumers in those markets, you realize that they're seeing New Zealand through the lens of what's happening in their home environment. And so you can see the countries that have had very good COVID responses, or where they've been very diligently following government advice and health advice, have one perspective of New Zealand. You see other countries where COVID's run rampant and the death rate's been very high, have a different view of New Zealand. And again, when it comes to reopening their countries, it's the same sort of concept, is that those that are following a very diligent sort of planned process a little bit have a different perspective than those who've just thrown the gates open and said, let's just let it rip, sort of thing. So I guess it sort of constantly highlights that you really have to understand the global consumer in their market and in their context.
Yeah,
Okay.
Really good.
Another question. No more questions from the group?
I've got a question for the group. How's that, Simon?
Yeah, good.
Which is, how do we, as an organization, so the New Zealand Story Group, how do we help, or what can we contribute to the members of the Communications Council to help you do your work with your clients? So as I travel around and I talk to different marketing and comms and PR agencies, etc., I often hear them talk about the fact that New Zealand needs to tell a better story on the world stage, and I'm wondering how we could better help you, because we're very open to doing different things differently. How do we make that happen? What would be valuable?
Does anyone have a perspective on that as a practitioner? I think it's an interesting question, David, because I suspect you don't know until you're in the process.
Yeah.
But I suspect the first answer is probably to know that you're available. As brands and agencies are working on campaigns, to realize that they're not, in an export context, to realize that they're not on their own, and actually there's a wealth of knowledge that can be drawn upon, it's also there free to be drawn upon, which in this world is very rare.
Yeah.
So
I guess
just being available
to add to that,
half the challenge.
The bit I was thinking, I agree with you completely. I mean, I see New Zealand communications companies, PR companies, ad agencies, etc., kind of losing clients to international agencies because your customers, your clients will say, oh, we need a US-based organization to help us with our US expansion or whatever it might be, because they have market insights and stuff. So what we hope that we might be able to do, for example, is close the gap a little bit. If you're a New Zealand-based comms agency, then maybe we can help you kind of better understand those markets and add some value to clients who are going internationally in a way that means you don't lose them as clients to other external markets.
Yeah, absolutely right. Any more questions? If not, we will give you the gift of time back. Look, thanks enormously to David and to Alex, and thank you everyone for attending this morning. I just want to share one more thing, which is our next, sorry, it's a bit clumsy in terms of, are you seeing my main screen or are you seeing my notes screen? I can never tell. Main screen. So our next learning session will be on May the 4th, and it is entitled Brandsplaining, Why Marketing is Still Sexist and How to Fix It. Philippa Roberts and Jane Cunningham, the co-authors of a book by the same name. They've spent the past 15 years researching with women in relation to marketing and communications, and it's a very thought-provoking but very constructive book, and it will be a thought-provoking and constructive session. So I just flagged that, but tickets will be available for that in the next couple of days. But beyond that, I'd like to say thank you once again to David and Alex. Thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll give you the gift of time back, and say have a great day. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Thank you, everybody.